My name is Margaret Ellis, and if you had told me 5 years ago that my only daughter would one day kick me out of her home, I would have laughed. I raised her on my own, after all, gave her everything I could possibly give, even when I had nothing left for myself. I used to tell her that love is measured not in words, but in the sacrifices we make when no one is watching. Clara was my miracle child. I had her at 38, after years of struggling to conceive and nearly giving up hope. My husband, Peter, and I were already middle-aged by the time she came along. We doted on her like she was spun from sunlight. Peter passed away when Clara was only 16, a heart attack in his sleep, sudden and cruel. I still remember how the world tilted that morning, how Clara screamed when she realized he wasn't waking up. From that day on, it was just her and me against everything. I worked at a small accounting firm back then, barely earning enough to cover school fees and bills. But I refused to let her dreams wither. I sold Peter's car, pawned my mother's pearls, and even took evening shifts cleaning offices just to save for her university. Every time I saw her smile, I told myself it was worth it, and for years I believed it was. When Clara graduated with a degree in design, she was radiant, full of ambition, full of promise. I was the proudest mother in the world, sitting in that crowded auditorium, clutching my little bouquet of roses and trying not to cry when she crossed the stage. She moved to London soon after, found a job with a marketing firm, and eventually met Daniel, a charming young property developer with an easy grin and an expensive watch. He was polite at first, even called me Mum during those early dinners, but as time went on, I began to notice the distance in his eyes whenever I spoke. The polite nods, the forced smiles. Still, when they married, I was genuinely happy for her. She looked beautiful in her lace gown, her hair pinned just so, her eyes full of dreams. I stood beside her during the photographs, clutching her hand as the photographer said, "Smile, ladies." And I did, though a strange sadness fluttered in my chest, like something precious was slipping away. After the wedding, we didn't speak as often. She was busy, of course. "Work, Mum," she'd say over the phone. "It's just been mad lately." I understood. She was building a life, and I didn't want to be the mother who clung too tightly. Then came the fire. It wasn't a big one, just an electrical fault in the flat next door to mine. But the smoke damage was enough to make the building unsafe. They told us we'd need to vacate for temporary repairs. I didn't have much, just a few boxes of books, some photos, and Peter's old watch, but those 4 walls had been my sanctuary. Losing them felt like losing him all over again. I called Clara that night, voice trembling. "Darling, I'm afraid I can't stay here for a while." I said softly, "They're evacuating everyone for repairs. I just need a place to stay for a few weeks." There was a pause. "Oh, right, of course, Mum. You can come here for a bit," she replied, but her voice lacked warmth. Still, I was grateful. I packed what little I had and caught the early train to her flat the next morning. When she opened the door, she smiled briefly and hugged me. The flat was modern, sleek, everything I'd never had. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble counters, the faint smell of expensive candles. "You can stay in the guest room," she said. "It's small, but you'll be comfortable." I smiled back. "Thank you, love. I'll try not to get in the way." At first, it wasn't so bad. I cooked dinner, kept the place tidy, and even mended a few of Daniel's shirts. But slowly, little things began to change. Daniel started making comments at breakfast. "You're up early again, Margaret. You must be bored without your own place." Or, "Clara, did you notice how much bread we're going through lately?" Clara would laugh awkwardly, but never defended me. A week turned into a month. The temporary repairs to my building stretched longer than expected. I offered to contribute to the bills, even gave Clara some of my savings, but she waved it off with a strained smile. Until one evening, It was raining heavily that night, the kind of rain that made the city blur outside the windows. I had cooked shepherd's pie, one of Clara's childhood favorites. We sat at the table in uncomfortable silence, the sound of cutlery echoing through the flat. Daniel cleared his throat. "So, Margaret," he said, "any word on when your flat will be ready?" I hesitated. "Not yet," they said, "perhaps another month, maybe 2. He exchanged a glance with Clara. "Right, it's just the guest room. You know we were planning to turn it into an office." I looked at my daughter, Clara. She didn't meet my eyes. "Mum, you know we love having you here, but it's getting difficult. You've been here for almost 3 months. Daniel's work is demanding, and we hardly have space as it is." I felt something twist inside me. "I see," I said quietly. "I didn't realize I'd become a burden." "No, not like that," she said quickly, then sighed. "It's just you don't really help with the bills, and Daniel's right. The grocery costs have gone up. You're another mouth to feed, Mum." The words landed like a slap. Another mouth to feed. I stared at her, my throat closing. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was my daughter, the child I had gone hungry for so she could eat, the girl I'd worked myself to exhaustion to keep warm and safe, and now she saw me as nothing more than an expense. Daniel stood and gathered the plates. Clara didn't look at me. "I'll start packing in the morning," I whispered. Neither of them stopped me. That night, I lay awake in the small guest bed, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the rain outside seemed to echo the same cruel phrase in my mind: another mouth to feed. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to be everything she needed: mother, father, friend. I remembered the nights I'd stayed up mending her school uniform, the mornings I'd gone without breakfast so she could have lunch money. And now I was too much, too old, too inconvenient. By dawn, I'd packed my bags, 1 suitcase, and a tote full of old photographs. Clara was still asleep when I left. I placed a note on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for everything, darling. I'll be fine. Love always, Mum." The taxi driver didn't ask where I was going, and I didn't really know what to tell him. I just asked him to take me anywhere that wasn't there. As the city rolled by through the rain-streaked window, I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered, "You'll regret this someday, my love. Not because I'll punish you, but because you'll finally understand what it means to lose the one person who would never have left you hungry." The rain didn't stop for 3 days after I left Clara's flat. It was as though the whole city was mourning with me: gray skies, dripping windows, puddles swallowing the pavements. London, for all its beauty, can be terribly cruel when you have nowhere to go. I wandered for hours with my suitcase, dragging behind me like a wounded pet. I had some savings, yes, but I didn't want to waste them on an expensive hotel. I told myself I'd find a short-term rental, a small room somewhere, but when I walked into the first estate agency, I quickly realized how naive I was. "600 a week, love," said the young man behind the desk, without looking up from his computer. "That's the cheapest we've got in Central." I smiled weakly and left before my voice betrayed me. By nightfall, my clothes were damp, and the ache in my chest had turned into something physical, a hollow ache that made every breath heavy. I sat on a bench under a bus stop, clutching my handbag, feeling utterly invisible. It's a strange thing to raise someone who becomes the reason you have no home. The betrayal isn't just in the words or the act. It's in the sudden absence of belonging. I must have dozed off because I woke to a voice above me. "Excuse me, madame, are you all right?" I blinked. A woman stood there, wrapped in a bright red scarf, her dark hair flecked with rain. She looked to be in her 60s. Behind her, a warm light spilled out from a small cafe. "I'm fine." I lied. She frowned. "You'll catch your death out here. Come inside for a cup of tea." "No charge?" I hesitated, then nodded. That's how I met Mrs. Patel. Her cafe was tiny, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while walking by. The walls were painted yellow, and the air smelled of cardamom and baked bread. Her husband, Mr. Patel, stood behind the counter, humming softly as he wiped down mugs. Mrs. Patel led me to a table near the window and placed a steaming cup before me. Drink, she said simply. I did. The warmth spread through me, melting the ice that had been clinging to my ribs since that night. We talked, or rather, she asked gentle questions, and I answered them slowly. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I just said that I'd lost my home and needed somewhere temporary. You're welcome to stay upstairs, she said suddenly. We've a small room. It's not much, but it's clean. I stared at her, stunned. Oh, I couldn't possibly. You can, and you will, she interrupted, smiling. Besides, I could use some help in the mornings. You look like the kind of woman who knows how to make proper tea. I laughed for the first time in weeks. That night, I slept in the small attic room above the cafe. It smelled faintly of sugar and coffee beans. The bed was narrow, the blankets old, but to me, it was heaven. The days that followed were quiet but kind. I woke early to help in the cafe, wiping tables, pouring tea, chatting with customers. Most of them were regulars, old men reading newspapers, students tapping away at laptops, delivery drivers grabbing sandwiches between routes. And then there was Thomas Whitmore. He came in every weekday at precisely 9:30. Always the same order, an Americano and a kvass, buttered twice. He was in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind thin, rimmed glasses and a voice that carried an easy calm. One morning, he noticed me struggling with the register and offered to help. Old machine, he said, tapping a few buttons. I've seen ones like this in some of my client cafes. You work with cafes? I asked. I'm a lawyer, he said with a small grin. Property and business law. But don't hold that against me, I laughed. He was easy to talk to, the kind of man who listened, really listened. Over the next few weeks, he'd linger a little longer after his coffee, asking about my day, telling me about his clients, his cases. I learned he had lost his wife 3 years earlier to illness. He lived alone, like me. One afternoon, as I was balancing the cafe's books, he glanced at my neat columns of numbers and said, "You're good at that. Ever worked in finance?" I nodded. Accounting. Retired now, though not by choice. He smiled. I might have some work for you. Part-time, flexible hours, just helping organize ledgers and invoices. Nothing too heavy. I hesitated. You'd trust a stranger with your client's accounts. He sipped his coffee. You don't strike me as the kind of woman who'd misplace a penny. And so, just like that, I found myself with a job again. It felt good, right, to be useful every morning. I worked at the cafe, then spent my afternoons reviewing files Thomas dropped off. I began to earn a modest income, enough to pay rent to the Patels and even save a little. For the first time since Clara's words had cut through me, I started to feel alive. But life has a cruel sense of irony. One evening, while going through some paperwork Thomas had brought me, I noticed a familiar name printed across the top of a contract, Hawthorne Estates Limited. The name meant nothing at first, but the address beneath it made my heart stop. 12 Westbridge Court, London SE4. That was Clara's building. The very flat where she and Daniel lived, where I had been told I was another mouth to feed. The file detailed an upcoming sale. Hawthorne Estates was divesting several properties, including 12 Westbridge Court, due to maintenance cost inefficiency. I read the words twice, feeling the old ache return. When Thomas noticed my pale face, he asked, "Something wrong?" I forced a smile, just recognizing an address. He looked at me carefully. Personal connection. You could say that. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling above my bed seemed to whisper to me, over and over, like a voice carried by the wind. You were thrown out of that place, and now it's being thrown away too. I sat up and switched on the lamp. The idea that had been flickering faintly in the back of my mind now burned bright. What if I bought it? The thought startled me at first. I wasn't a rich woman. I had savings, yes, the remnants of Peter's life insurance. Some investments that had quietly grown over the years, but nothing extravagant. Still, Thomas had mentioned that the property group was eager to sell quickly. The next morning, over tea, I told him I was interested in purchasing one of his client listings for investment purposes. I didn't specify which. He blinked, then smiled. You surprise me, Mrs. Ellis. Most people your age are thinking about downsizing, not becoming landlords. I smiled faintly. Sometimes life teaches you the value of owning what you were once denied. He agreed to handle legalities discreetly. Within weeks, after a whirlwind of forms, signatures, and sleepless nights, the deal was done. I, Margaret Ellis, owned 12 Westbridge Court, the same building my daughter lived in, the same building from which I had been cast out like unwanted furniture. When the confirmation email arrived, I stared at it for a long time. My hands trembled slightly as I read the words. Transfer complete. I expected to feel triumph, some fiery surge of satisfaction, but instead, what I felt was quieter, deeper. It wasn't vengeance yet. It was justice slowly waking that evening. Mrs. Patel noticed my faraway look and asked, "You seem thoughtful tonight. Good news." I smiled softly, perhaps. "I've just reclaimed something that once made me feel small." She patted my hand. "Then you've already won." I nodded, "Not quite." I murmured, "But soon." Owning 12 Westbridge Court felt surreal. Every morning, I would walk past the building, hands clasped behind my back, observing the same windows where my daughter and Daniel lived. I never imagined that the very structure that had once rejected me could become my quiet instrument of empowerment. I didn't rush. Revenge, I had learned, was not a flame to be kindled immediately. It was an art that required patience, precision, and the sort of cold calculation that comes from being hurt deeply. My first weeks were spent studying the tenants, the leases, the maintenance schedules. I memorized the floors, the units, the names of people who worked there. I became the building in a sense, part observer, part silent presence. Clara and Daniel, of course, were unaware. I remained anonymous in the records, listed under a corporate alias Thomas had recommended, E. Marlowe Properties Limited. I took satisfaction in seeing the notice of new ownership mailed to the tenants, watching as the envelope was opened and letters examined with curiosity. At first, Clara didn't even think about it. I imagine she assumed it was a routine change, one of those faceless corporate things she had no interest in understanding. That suited me perfectly. I wanted her to feel as ordinary as any other tenant before the storm. Weeks later, I called Thomas to discuss the next step. "I'm thinking of a reasonable rent adjustment," I said, trying to sound casual. "Reasonable?" he asked. "You mean how much?" "Enough to remind a mother that she is not invisible. Enough that they will notice me." Thomas chuckled. "I'd call that poetic." And poetic it was. I raised the rent by threefold, a figure shocking enough to destabilize Clara and Daniel without seeming arbitrary. I included detailed explanations about market adjustments, maintenance upgrades, and other official-sounding language. Every word meticulously chosen, every sentence a dagger wrapped in velvet. The day Clara opened the official notice, she nearly dropped the letter. I imagine her first thought was confusion, then anger, then desperation. I had already anticipated her reaction, rehearsed it in my mind as if it were a play I was starring in. When she stormed into the building office, the very office I had been observing and visiting as the manager for a few tenants, she found me sitting behind the desk, calm, composed, as if I had always belonged there. "Mum." Her voice cracked, disbelief blending with fury. I looked up slowly, fixing her with my gaze. "Hello, Clara." She pointed at me. What are you doing here?" Why would you do this?" I leaned back, letting my fingers trace the edge of the ledger in front of me. "Do what, dear?" "I merely exercised my rights as the property owner. You were always curious about how the market works, weren't you?" Daniel appeared behind her, his suit tight around his shoulders, his face flushed. "This is insane. We can't pay this. Who gave you the right?" "You did, indirectly," I said softly, "when you told me I was an extra mouth. When you said I was inconvenient. When you made me leave your home as if I were nothing more than furniture in your life. That was your permission. Clara's face was white, tears brimming. Mum, I raised a hand, halting her. No. Don't speak. I want you to feel this just for a moment. Feel the helplessness I felt when my own daughter deemed me unnecessary. Her shoulders slumped, and for a brief instant, the daughter I had once nurtured looked smaller than I had ever seen her. I could have done worse, I said, my voice soft, almost tender, but I am not cruel. You have a choice. Pay the rent, adjust your life, or find somewhere else. I will give you 3 months. Daniel swore under his breath. Clara bit her lip. I could almost hear her heartbeat, fast, erratic, full of panic. I had imagined this moment for years. The words I had whispered to the rain, slicked streets of London, the promise that someday they would understand what it meant to lose the one who gave everything, were finally coming true. But I wasn't done. That night, I walked the building, checking on the tenants. Some were worried, others angry, and some simply resigned. Yet the one satisfaction I felt wasn't cruelty toward strangers. It was quiet triumph of setting the balance right. I hadn't harmed anyone who didn't deserve it. I hadn't sought to punish indiscriminately. I had merely reminded Clara and Daniel that every action had consequences, that kindness and respect are not owed but earned, and that love cannot thrive in a house where cruelty dwells. Later, I sat in the small cafe above the street, sipping tea as I watched the rain. Thomas noticed my contemplative silence. You look satisfied, he said cautiously. I am, I admitted, not because they suffered, but because I remembered my worth. Because I finally belonged somewhere to myself, he smiled. I'd call that a victory. I nodded, allowing myself the smallest smile. Victory was not vengeance. Victory was dignity. Clara didn't speak to me for weeks. She sent emails, text messages, pleading, negotiating. I read each one carefully. Some were desperate, others apologetic. I responded sparingly, always firm, always distant. The lessons had to be learned on her terms. At first, I had thought the act of raising the rent was the climax of my revenge, but it was not. The true climax came from watching her realize what she had lost, what she had dismissed, and finally understanding, painfully, that a mother's love is not infinite when treated as disposable. In those long nights, I allowed myself to feel a mixture of sorrow and relief. I mourned the daughter who had once been my world, but I rejoiced in the woman I was becoming, independent, respected, and, most importantly, unafraid. I had been cast aside as an extra mouth. Now I was the one who determined the terms of nourishment in that household, and for the first time in years I felt full. The weeks that followed were strange. Clara and Daniel moved with a careful precision, adjusting their lives to the new rent I had imposed. I didn't gloat openly. I had never been that type of woman. My satisfaction was quieter, almost imperceptible. It lived in the subtle tightening of Clara's brow when she calculated expenses, in Daniel's muttered complaints at the dinner table, in the polite but measured emails they sent. And yet, there was something I hadn't expected, an ache, a hollow warmth that accompanied their suffering. Revenge, even when carefully measured, leaves traces in your own heart. I found myself walking the streets of London in the evenings, thinking about the past, the years I had spent giving, sacrificing, hoping for love that was sometimes absent. One rainy Tuesday, as I polished the office desk at 12 Westbridge Court, a thought struck me. Words had power, letters even more so. I decided to write to Clara, not as a mother demanding obedience, not as a landlord asserting authority, but as a woman who had loved, who had been hurt, and who had learned that boundaries and self-respect are necessary for survival. I took my time with it. Every sentence mattered. I wrote about my heartbreak, about the night she told me I was an extra mouth. I wrote about the cold streets, the kindness of strangers like the Patels, and the strength I found within myself. I explained why I had raised the rent, but not to punish, but to teach a lesson about respect and the consequences of taking love for granted. Finally, I ended the letter not with anger, but with hope. I do not want to be your enemy. I want you to understand. I want you to grow. And perhaps one day we can find each other again, not as mother and daughter bound by obligation, but as women who have learned to respect and love each other. I sealed the envelope and sent it via first-class mail. There was no rush, there was no need. The message, I hoped, would arrive at its own pace, giving Clara time to reflect. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding myself completely. The cafe became my sanctuary. Mrs. Patel and I developed a rhythm, and Thomas continued to be my steady presence, offering quiet companionship without intrusion. I took long walks along the Thames, watched the sunrise over the rooftops of London, and finally allowed myself to enjoy simple pleasures that I had long ignored while consumed with heartbreak. I realized that true victory of my story was not the raised rent, not the quiet power I wielded over Clara and Daniel. It was reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my sense of self. I no longer defined myself by their rejection or approval. I had become my own anchor in the storm. Then one afternoon the unexpected happened. A small envelope arrived at the cafe, addressed to me in familiar handwriting, Clara's. I felt a flutter of nervousness and anticipation, a mixture of fear and longing. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter of apology, heartfelt and trembling, filled with words she had once been too young or too self-absorbed to say. She acknowledged her cruelty, admitted her selfishness, and, for the first time, truly recognized the love I had given her despite everything. She wrote of regret. Yes, but also of growth, of wanting to rebuild what we had lost. She didn't ask for forgiveness outright, understanding that it must be earned. She simply extended a hand across the pages, offering an olive branch, tentative, fragile, but real. I read the letter over and over, tears streaming silently down my cheeks. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, the possibility that my daughter could understand, even if only partially, the depth of my sacrifice and my hurt. And in that quiet moment, sitting among the aroma of tea and cardamom in the little cafe above the street where I had rebuilt my life, I felt an extraordinary sense of peace. I was no longer the woman who had been cast aside. I was Margaret Ellis, mother, survivor, and the author of my own story. I never returned 12 Westbridge Court simply to gloat. I let Clara and Daniel find their footing, navigating their new reality, but I kept the ownership as a reminder, not of vengeance, but of the strength that comes from being wronged and rising above it. Sometimes when I walked past the building, I saw Clara at the window. Sometimes she waved, sometimes she didn't, and that was fine. Reconnection, like respect, takes time. The rain still fell, as it always did in London, but now it felt gentle, cleansing rather than bitter. I had learned that love is not about blind sacrifice, nor is it about punishment. It is about understanding, boundaries, and the courage to reclaim your own life. And as I sipped my tea that evening, watching the city lights shimmer across wet pavements, I allowed myself the quietest, sweetest thought. I had survived, I had endured, I had risen, and no one, not even my own daughter, could take that away from me.